Hello and welcome to Fidelity Connects. I'm Pamela Ritchie. After what seems like forever, Parliament resumes in Ottawa next week with no shortage of legislative issues on the agenda. Tariffs, housing, U.S. relations, China, energy, even a budget, of course. These are only some of the topics that may be tackled in the House this session. And all of this follows an unprecedented election campaign won by Mark Carney just a few weeks after winning the Liberal Party nomination. So what can investors and advisors expect from the fall session, and what can they expect from Prime Minister Carney himself? I'm very excited to be joined today by Andrew Bevan. He is the National Campaign Co-Director for Prime Minister Mark Carney. He is also CEO at Canada-U.S. A warm welcome to you, Andrew. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you for having me. Happy to be here.
It's extraordinary what Mark Carney and you and your team managed to pull off in a very short period of time. Can we begin just by asking you to kind of back up to what December through March meant for you? I mean, did you sleep?
Not too much.
No,
not too much,
no.
but I wasn't expecting to, so
No,
that's
okay.
okay. Well, I mean, it was an interesting 6 months. I mean, the former Prime Minister had appointed me campaign director at Thanksgiving last year, with the expectation that the election campaign was going to be some point in 2025. Obviously, other events overtook all of that, starting in December. And then the former Prime Minister Trudeau, announcing his intended resignation in early January. So throughout all of that, I remained as the campaign director, and we had been preparing for an election anyway. I'd been put in there to make sure that we had people nominated, we had all the pieces of a campaign ready to go. It becomes more complicated when you don't know who the leader's going to be in that campaign, which became the case in January. So a campaign that we'd been planning for with one leader suddenly became a campaign we were planning for with somebody we didn't know that would be leader. And then over the course of sort of February and March, it became clear that Mr. Carney was going to probably win the leadership, so we could sort of start planning around that, always knowing that the election campaign was going to begin by the end of March.
I mean, but you couldn't print signs, you couldn't get ready.
Well, we did print signs.
Did you actually?
Yeah, I mean, for candidates. Those are the sorts of things we did get done in terms of signing off on designs. And I mean, some things need more than the lead time we were going to be given of 2.5 weeks between Mr. Carney being elected leader and the election starting. So,
like what, for instance?
So, you have to have some of the big things in place, like having a contract with Air Canada to have an airplane to be able to get around the country for the campaign. Things like putting a wrap on the media bus and the bus that's going to take the leader around the country. So we did wrap the media bus with a generic Liberal wrap and waited and hoped that we would have enough time to do the other one once we knew whose photograph to put on the bus, which we did. I mean, it happened in the first few days of the campaign, but we knew it couldn't be done for day one. So anyway, a whole range of pieces that had to come together fairly quickly. But on the basis of having sort of 60 or 70% of a campaign in place for whomever the new leader was going to be, and then add in the extra 30% of the new leader's brand and what they stood for and their platform, etc., which could be literally just plopped onto what we built.
How many campaigns have you run over the course of the years? I mean, this was obviously...
Oh boy. Well, I mean, when I was younger, much younger, in the 1990s, starting with local campaigns. So run quite a lot of local campaigns, provincially and federally. And then central campaigns, both in Ontario and in Ottawa, probably 5 or 6. So yeah, quite a few, and they're all different. They are all unique. This is just more unique than usual.
I bet, absolutely. I mean, things like even advertising space, I think you had mentioned, can take quite a long lead time because you have to know spots and things. How did you scramble to get that? Or again, the team had certain things in place.
Yes, we had that in place in terms of what our buy would be and how that would be played out over the course of what we thought would be a 5-week campaign, although that would be up to the incoming leader as to how long the election would actually be. So that, those sorts of things you can get done. What you can't get done, obviously, is work on the content very much of what those ads are going to look like. Now, having said that, by the time we got into the last couple of weeks of the leadership campaign and it became clear that Mr. Carney was going to win, we could begin to figure out, exactly what that would entail.
Messaging.
And you may remember that even before that, in February, we, as a party, as a campaign, put out television ads, quite a big buy on television about Trump and Polyev and trying to compare the two and put those two things together in people's minds. So we already had some advertising going that was a contrast but we couldn't put together the advertising that was about the new leader and what they stood for.
The administration in the United States was a big player in the Canadian election. How big a player were they?
Definitely a big player. I think two different things. There's sort of an inside story and an outside story to this. One is obviously the threat from the Trump administration, or from Trump himself, and what that entailed took up a lot of public oxygen in the campaign, most definitely. And therefore, it meant that a lot of the campaign revolved around that in terms of the dialogue over the course of the campaign. But, underneath that, and this remains true today, the issues that were then most important to Canadians and remain so are much more around the economy and cost of living and affordability and housing and those pieces that affects them and touches them every day. Now, these two things come together, obviously. If you have an economic threat from the Trump administration, which is going to have an effect on macroeconomy, that's going to affect Canadians and obviously exacerbate some of those cost of living issues potentially. So they are, in a way, one and the same issue, but not projected that way over the course of the campaign. So it was obviously very, very important. And again, I think that probably now Mr. Carney won a strong minority, and I think part of that is because he was able to speak to both pieces, and his experience, expertise, and the way he could talk about what the country needed to do in the face of Trump was trusted because of how people quickly took the measure of the man, and knew what his experience was, and saw it as being the right experience and the right person for the moment, and the right sort of tenor for the moment as well. I think.
Speak more about that. Calm,
professional. Been through crises before. Understands what they're about. Understands how to deal with them. Understands how you get from the beginning to the end of them in one piece, or better. And I think he exuded that in the campaign quite quickly. He had an amazingly quick run. This is the most unique thing of all of this, really, in terms of him entering formal politics in January and becoming Prime Minister in March. That is, it's highly unusual, and is, to me, is an example of just how impressive he is in terms of figuring these things out.
So when you think about the month of April started off with Liberation Day, which of course is in the middle of an election campaign here. I wonder, just take us through some of the messaging there. I mean, you were still very much involved. The actual election was rolling. And crises were sort of being dropped all over the Canadian economy. I wonder how some of that was used to the benefit of the campaign, not to sort of capitalize too much on individual problems, but it was used astutely.
Well, look, I mean, more than usual, it was absolutely necessary for a campaigning Prime Minister to also be acting as Prime Minister in the Prime Minister's office in terms of what was happening and coming at us.
I mean, that was useful on some level. It really was.
It certainly was. Politically, it was useful because it allowed people to see the Prime Minister being Prime Minister in the midst of a campaign. Didn't have to pretend to know what he might be like as Prime Minister. You could see it right in front of your eyes, and you could see it in circumstances which were fairly dire day by day in terms of what was coming at us. So, unusually we had to plan for allowing the Prime Minister to be Prime Minister during the campaign as opposed to just being a candidate. And that was unusual.
In terms of travel and geography, did you have to make sure he was in Ottawa more often than he might have been?
We had to know that we could get here if we needed to. The Trump administration doesn't tell people what it's going to do very often in advance, so you don't know when they're going to do what. So had to be ready for surprises and have a plan to get back as required.
Okay.
Yeah. And now
back on the phone to Air Canada.
Well, happily you have a plane charter for the whole time, so it's okay. It's sitting there waiting for you. Usually, if you're lucky.
So let's talk a little bit about within the campaign the discussion of what became sort of an energy discussion. There were carbon taxes to deal with. There was a shift in policy in the midst of it all. And in order to win the election, there were a lot of pieces there that had to be tackled, honestly, on Canada's energy producing economy and where that goes from here. And we're still questioning where that goes from here. It seems to still be an open question. That particular area, a lot of questions were answered, and the Prime Minister spent a lot of time actually in Alberta, didn't he, and out west. How did you plan for that, tackle that, make sure that those messages ultimately were winners?
Yeah, I mean, look, it was, first of all, with any candidate, any new candidate, you want to make sure people gain an understanding of what they're about and what motivates them. What the values are, but what motivates them as well. And so making it clear that he had been brought up in Alberta was useful in a pan-Canadian sense, because he had the Northwest Territories, Alberta, living in Ontario. I mean, there's a range of pieces of the country that he understands innately, and trying to make sure people understood that was important. Secondly, I think people make a lot of this, but it really isn't that unusual that a new Prime Minister will be different than the last one, and will try to prove themselves to be so. First of all, they are different people. They're not, quite clearly, Mr. Trudeau and Mr. Carney are quite different people, different set of experiences, and came into office, or were trying to come into office from Mr. Carney's side at very different times in very different contexts. You put those things together with what was coming at us after November of last year from the US, and what that meant in terms of what we needed to do at home, that confluence of events lends itself to change in terms of policies that are important and integral to the country and to the economy. And this, I think Canadians also gave some leeway to the Prime Minister on when it came to energy and the environment, energy and climate change, because they know or knew of his history on climate change. As a central banker and elsewhere, and knew that there was a balance there that could be calibrated responsibly for the moment, to get us through now, and then figure out how we're going to get through tomorrow.
So that's very interesting, because it's an area that it was certainly thought that Pierre Poilievre's campaign, it was known, had an enormous amount of money in its coffers. They were ready to go. They had raised significant amounts of money, more than the Liberal Party, as we understand. Was that an impediment at all?
No. So firstly, absolutely true, the Conservatives raised more money than Liberals. But we both had fully funded campaigns. There's a campaign limit for what you're allowed to spend over the course of that 5 weeks. We were fully funded for that, as were the Conservatives, so you're on equal footing the day the election starts. At that point, it's because about how you're spending that money. What proportion of it are you spending on advertising, what proportion are you spending it on travel, etc. The difference is that before the campaign, they had more money to spend than we did on advertising. And that was fairly apparent, although we started to get into the advertising frame on television and other platforms, as I said, in January and February. We'd waited until then to spend our pre-written money. Second thing that happened for us is that actually 2024 was a very good fundraising year for the Liberal Party of Canada for a range of reasons. I think people who were giving to the Liberal Party were worried about the potential of a Poilievre government, and therefore were enthusiastic about being donors. They hadn't walked away from being donors. And then when Mr. Carney became leader, it turned out that he was very good at fundraising in terms of figuring out how to raise more money in addition. So we actually ended up having more money than we thought we would before the writ started, so we could spend even more on advertising. And the Conservatives didn't spend. They spent a lot last year on advertising, but not as much as we thought they might this spring.
Hello, investors. We'll be back to the show in just a moment. I wanted to share that here at Fidelity, we value your opinion. Please take a few minutes to help us shape the future of Fidelity Connect's podcasts. Complete our listener survey by visiting fidelity.ca/survey, and you could win one of our branded tumblers. Periodic draws ending by March 30th, 2026. And don't forget to listen to Fidelity Connects, The Upside, and French Dialogue Fidelity podcasts, available on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever else you get your podcasts. Now back to today's show.
From recent announcements that we've heard just over the course of the last several days, actually, the Buy Canada discussion of how we're going to apparently power the economy forward is to spend the money here rather than to buy from abroad. Take us into that notion and how that's evolved, if you wouldn't mind. It sounds like whatever we're going to build, we're going to try and use resources from here. That's a big pivot.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I try and use the same short form the Prime Minister did during the election campaign, which is, in just a few words, in order to build Canada strong, we're going to fight, protect, and build. And those three pieces are equally important. First of all, fight to defend the interests of Canada when it comes to negotiation with the U.S. Around tariffs, around security, around everything. Secondly, no matter what happens in those negotiations, on the protect side, protect Canadian businesses, protect Canadian workers who are impacted by whatever comes at us from the U.S. And we've seen some of that over the course of the last few weeks and last few days. Yeah. And then the third part, I think probably the most important part, is the build piece. As the Prime Minister often said, what we can control here at home, we should control. And that means building up the Canadian economy with the levers we have available to ourselves as a country, government, private sector, and beyond, to do some things we haven't done in the recent past, but now are being forced to and need to.
Defense is there.
Yeah.
Housing is going to be another one. These are things that actually don't get built overnight, although we're looking at housing that sometimes get built in 3 days, which is sort of amazing. But take us into these areas, how we can spend the money that is earmarked at this point, which is a lot. There's a lot of different areas it needs to be spent on. The package of sort of security and a new CUSMA, USMCA, however we're looking at that, how much of that security is defense?
Yeah, I mean, I think it comes down to two main elements: defense and then border security. So
right.
those two things hand in hand. I mean, you're right. There are some big investments to be made. I think the government, and this is true in the election campaign and thereafter, has tried very hard to make it clear that this isn't just about the federal government or provincial governments spending a whole lot of new money just for the sake of building federal projects. It's kind of the opposite of that. It's trying to make sure that, in the Prime Minister's words, the governments catalyze private sector spending to come in behind big federal capital spending to build some of these big projects that we need to build. And some of them are hard infrastructure projects around natural resources. Some of them are around other, I don't know, you use the word softer, but
you get the dual use discussion about everything from firefighting to different machinery that would be used by both.
Yeah, and how do you do other things that can be the equivalent of nation building projects, such as being a leader in AI across the border, or being a leader in carbon dioxide removal, for example. And there's a whole range of different projects that we could do as a country and invest in that certainly have a public sector role, both in terms of investment and through regulation, but also require private sector investment.
And so if we're to sort of look at both of those, the private sector investment sounds like it fits into the sort of nudge or catalyze, I think is the word you like, because it's the name of your company, to get the public sector, get it moving, and then have private investors come after it. That sounds a little bit longer term versus money that is about to be spent. We think on basically shovel-ready projects. Is that right?
I think that's right. I mean, I think obviously some of the projects that will be purely government funded will
happen now.
Yes, will happen more quickly. But I would hope, and I know the government hopes, that will extend beyond those shovel-ready pieces now into other spaces that can happen fast. And
we're talking rails. What are we talking? What projects are we talking?
Yes. I mean,
ports.
So there's a whole range of infrastructure projects. The province have had a list. There was a list that was leaked in the newspaper last week, I think, of 19 potential projects. Those are mostly hard infrastructure projects. There's a whole range of other pieces beyond that would could have potentially huge economic effect in Canada if we get the mix right between public and private investment.
And that's AI. What else?
Yes. Well, it's figuring out the energy and climate space. Where are we on clean energy, clean tech? What are we doing? How are we going to use the new defense investments to drive advances in other areas beyond defense itself and in various technologies? Trying to make sure we leverage every dollar of federal government spending and provincial government spending into hopefully getting the equivalent of matching from the private sector, but making sure that you actually get bigger results than just federal government investment itself. On
the technology side of things, that, as you say, defense spending could then catalyze other types of spending that comes in there. I mean, we're reading lots about space companies and how Canada has their own versus using others. What else within there?
Well, I mean, there are many large and small companies that are in the defense space in Canada who are now figuring out how they can grow their footprint given the additional spending. So, for example, I represent a company in Merrickville that builds EV boats, 36 and 40-foot boats. They've figured out the mix between how you have a strong hydrocarbon hull and a heavy battery pack, and they already have contracts in the U.S. and Canada, both in defense and security space. But figuring out how they're going to ramp up their production, given what is going on, not just here in additional spending in Canada, but other countries around the world too, and across NATO, is a huge opportunity, both for local, regional economic development, but also on the technology side. And being a leader in EV boats is a space which could be quite valuable. So you can repeat that across a number of different sectors and technologies as these public investments roll out.
What sort of regulations will be either removed or try to be removed in terms of the red tape to be taken away, which the major projects office will sort of work to do that? And we heard about the announcement of John Farrell, who had been at Trans Mountain, and had pushed that through and made it happen. She's now going to be the head of this. She will be probably well informed about red tape that needs to come out of things. What kind of layers of that will come out, and what kind of new ones might go back in?
Right, yeah, interesting question. I mean, so first of all, Dawn Farrell, immensely impressive person. I got to work with her quite a bit on Trans Mountain over the course of 2024, and she's exactly the right person to lead that office, and it's located in exactly the right place in terms of the natural resource. Calgary, right? Calgary, for the natural resource projects. She knows how to get those things done. Trans Mountain was difficult to make happen. It was difficult to make happen for a whole range of complex and complicated issues. The private sector did not want to do it, so the federal government stepped in at great expense. From Canadian taxpayer dollars, $34 billion or something. But it's already paying dividends. It's paying dividends in terms of revenue to the federal government. It's paying dividends to the private sector companies that are using it. So it's been a worthwhile project in pure economic terms, despite how difficult it was to get from here to there.
And that it was owned by the government. And that it was owned by the
government. And that may not be the case forever. I mean, I don't think the intent is to own pipelines across the country as a federal government. But she knows how to navigate through that morass of understandably difficult pieces as you build these things across a massive landscape, which has all kinds of different interests attached to it. So if you take that back to your question about regulations and red tape, it's going to be interesting to see how they deal with that. I mean, C5 began that process in terms of laying out what the government's intent was on this front, and that the government was serious on doing things more efficiently, more quickly. That then has to actually play out on the ground.
And there's pushback obviously there, and that's perhaps not surprising. Okay, so we'll watch for some of these things to be tackled in Parliament over the course of the next session. Tell us a little bit about what we might see in the trade relations between the U.S. and Canada. You hear everything from there just will be a certain floor of tariffs. We don't know what that will be. Maybe it will be low. We hope it won't be high, but they just will be there, and that's the way it'll be. To everything in between. There'll be pieces of the structure that remain in certain areas. Tell us what you're hearing. Give us a sense of where this might go, and actually when it might begin. We're hearing this fall.
Yes. This may be the most impossible question you will ask me. I think people generally understand that we are in a world where, unfortunately, we are negotiating across the table from an American president who isn't always clearly understanding what his own interests might be, let alone us knowing what those interests might be and how we might meet them or begin to share meeting them in order to get to an agreement. There's a lot of irrationality to what he has done to the Canadian economy, the global economy, and to the American economy. Quite frankly, it doesn't make a lot of sense. So how do trying to figure out how you then come to an arrangement with that sort of a player is difficult to forecast. Having said that, there's the Japan model, which there are various models. There are various models, none of which look very attractive to us as Canadians, given what we have at the moment. And you're right. I mean, the real risk out there obviously is what's going to happen with the review of CUSMA in 2026, which is now people don't use the word review. They basically always talk about
it's going to be renegotiated.
It's going to be a renegotiation. And that is obviously the most important part because, as the government keeps on pointing out, at the moment we're in fairly good shape in terms of what is covered or not covered by US tariffs. Okay. We obviously have sectoral difficulties. We have sectoral difficulties in important sectors of the Canadian economy, which is what they're now, it appears, concentrating on sorting through piece by piece, which seems to me to make sense in the context of what might have to happen with CUSMA later on.
That's really interesting. Who are some of the players negotiating this deal? We see Dominic LeBlanc certainly doing most of it through, I think, the summer. Now Michael Sabia, who's the head of the Privy Council, is maybe he needed to give Dominic LeBlanc a break. I don't know. But tell us about the players, how they're going to fit together, a little bit of the approach here in terms of personnel.
Yeah, I mean, look, the reality is there are a number of players on the US side. And so the Canadian side tries to match that to a certain extent. Okay. You're right about Dominic LeBlanc, who has formal carriage in the cabinet for Canada-U.S. relations. Michael Sabia and Marc-André Blanchard, who's the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff, the two of them are very heavily involved. Obviously, our ambassador to the U.S., the very impressive Kirsten Hillman, is a point person on all of this and has been there happily since the last negotiation of CUSMA. So knows the people, knows the players, knows it like the back of her hand, and it is obviously the most important file on her desk. So there are a range of people engaged with their counterparts in the US because, trying to make sure this isn't just about negotiating with one man is important. And trying to understand as I was saying before, the interests of the Commerce Secretary or the Trade Rep is as important as knowing where the President might sit. So, where that lands, I think Canadians, my guess is Canadians know that, first of all, this is a very difficult road to hoe. That if you're dealing with an international player, you can't necessarily expect success. And that takes us back to, what are the things we do control as opposed to things we don't control, and concentrating on those as a government as well. Okay.
One thing that, there's an element of control, but not entirely, is that China is a massive trading partner for Canada after the US, the largest. And the US administration is going to make sure that Canada and Mexico don't do too much trade with China. That's just going to be part of it. What do we do with that? Do you lean into other Asian trade? How do we deal with that, especially now?
Yeah, it's an obvious complicating factor in terms of trying to figure out how you're dealing with the U.S. negotiation while knowing what their interest is re China. We have different interests on the trade side, certainly, with China, as you say, massive trading relationship. The government has made it clear that it's going to be re-engaging with India, for example, which I think is part of that offset, and broadening trade relationships around the world. Obviously, there's a full range of activity going on with our European friends at the macro level, but also the individual project level, and joint projects in the defense space, those sorts of things.
So stitching it together.
Yes, and there are many pieces stitched together, right? It's quite a quilt, and it's not one thing that's going to get us out of this. It is going to be many. And trying to do all those things at once is important. The Prime Minister said last week, that this government can do more than one thing at once. Yeah. That's good because it has to do dozens.
It's good. Hope many means, hundreds. Yes, yeah. We began sort of talking about the galvanizing ability for Canada and how the campaign that you organized made that happen in Canada, along with, an external player. It's still there, the national pride right now. Yeah. I don't know if there's impatience. There's certainly some tariff fatigue for all kinds of people in industry in this country. But what would you say to sort of the national pride moment that are we still in it?
I think we are. I think it ebbs and flows a little bit, but it ebbs and flows from a base of fairly intense pride and understanding what we're about and what we want to be, who we want to be, how we want to project, how we want to live our lives. I think there's two other interesting elements that come into play, and there's sort of both, we're in a moment of both anxiety and ambition. And there's anxiety about what's happening economically, there's anxiety about what the US is trying to do, there's anxiety what the kinds of words that Trump is using about 51st state, etc. that is anxiety-inducing for all of us as individuals, let alone what it might mean economically. There's an ambition, though, as well, which is in the face of that, for both defensive and offensive purposes, it's a moment where we actually need to do big things for ourselves. And when I've been talking to folks in the private sector, that comes across very much as being top of mind, even in the face of what looks like some potential economic headwinds with a more fragile economy than we would wish. Yeah. Despite that, I think there's still a feeling that we need to do these things no matter what. Don't batten down the hatches. Right. Keep on going, because if we don't, we're going to be in more trouble.
And you're hearing that from industry leaders that you're working with. Yeah. Does that extend to the budget? This will be the final question. Does that extend to the budget, which will have to, kind of walk a tightrope between maybe Canada going into recession, maybe in recession, we don't know yet, and these major projects?
Yeah, I think it does. I mean, I think it's as always, budgets are complicated. It has to do at least two things at once. It has to, on the one hand, save money over here so you can invest over there in the simplest of terms. And probably do so with a fairly large deficit. But the country is in a good fiscal position, so that's affordable. And we are at a moment where we have to do some things that cost money. And whether it's on the fight side, the protect side, or the build side, those things don't come free. That people were writing in their newspaper. I saw that Canadians are beginning to see what the cost of sovereignty is. There is a cost to it. The cost right now is higher than usual.
Andrew Bevan, it's a delight to meet you. Thank you very much for sharing your time here on Fidelity Connects.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for watching or listening to the Fidelity Connects podcast. Now, if you haven't done so already, please subscribe to Fidelity Connects on your podcast platform of choice. And if you like what you're hearing, please leave a review or a 5-star rating. Fidelity mutual funds and ETFs are available by working with a financial advisor or through an online brokerage account. Visit fidelity.ca/howtobuy for more information. While on fidelity.ca, you can also find more information on future live webcasts. And don't forget to follow Fidelity Canada on YouTube, LinkedIn, and Instagram. We'll end today's show with a short disclaimer. The views and opinions expressed on this podcast are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of Fidelity Investments Canada-U.S. or its affiliates. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be construed as investment, tax, or legal advice. It is not an offer to sell or buy, or an endorsement, recommendation, or sponsorship of any entity or securities cited. Read a fund's prospectus before investing. Funds are not guaranteed. Their values change frequently and past performance may not be repeated. Fees, expenses, and commissions are all associated with fund investments. Thanks again. We'll see you next time.